Hello, Geography 232 students. Welcome to week 12 of our class. We are coming down the home stretch. So this week we are talking again about Model Builder. This is Model Builder Part 2, Customizing a Model. And I'm going to talk about a few of the customization options when you use Model Builder in ArcGIS Pro. But like I mentioned last week, a lot of the skills that I discuss in this lecture are applicable to ArcMap as well. So feel free to learn what you can. If you're using ArcMap, feel free to use this lecture video to help out your journey through ArcMap. But as I said, this is all designed for ArcGIS Pro. So this week's lecture is Model Builder Part 2, Customizing a Model. This week's lab is Build a Model to Connect Mountain Lion Habitat. And upon completion of this lecture and lab, you should know how to define model parameters, create and insert model variables, and create and run complex models. So if you think back to last week's lab, it was fairly basic. We did create a really interesting tool that can be used, a geoprocessing tool that can be used and shared with others, including the use of parameters, input variables. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about parameters. We sort of jumped into it last week without actually knowing a whole lot of the background on that. So I'll give you the background this week. But this week's lab is going to be far more complex. You're going to end up with a lot of different inputs, a lot of different parameters, a lot of different outputs, and also the data set, instead of being all vector, will also rely on raster data as well. So you're going to be combining raster and vector data for this week's lab. So just be aware of that. And so, one more kind of tool in the toolkit that you're developing as a GIS user. So a quick outline of this week's lecture: model parameters in ArcGIS Pro, standalone variables, inline variables, and intermediate data. So we're going to cover each of these points quickly this week. All right, so a little bit more about parameters. Now, obviously, as I said, we spent some time talking about and creating parameters last week, so we'll talk a little bit about the background there. So in Model Builder, tools often require or allow specific value inputs to run in order to run. So these inputs are known as parameters, and you'll remember the parameters when you set a input variable or a tool as a parameter, you'll see a little P over the oval. Okay, so an example of a parameter might be with the buffer tool, you'll need to set the buffer distance. So instead of presetting that, if it's not a parameter where you have that option to change it, if you don't have it as a parameter, you have to predefine the distance in advance. If it's a parameter, essentially it's a user-defined variable. So if you're creating a tool for somebody to use, if you make the buffer distance a parameter, they can then choose. Is it going to be 500 feet, 1,000 feet, 20,000 feet, 1 kilometer, and so on and so forth. So that's the great thing about parameters, is it essentially allows for other users and yourself to change specific points along the way versus just having everything predefined in advance. Model parameters are the input conditions that appear on the model tool dialog box. So those are essentially the input conditions that you have an option to change once it's either when it's still in model format or as a tool. And any variable in a model can be made a model parameter. So input data, the geoprocessing options, those all have myriad parameter options, and also the output location. So just be aware that any sort of variable in a model, whether it be an oval, rectangle, green, or blue, has a option to set it as a parameter. So when a variable is made into a model parameter, its value can be specified in the model tool dialog box. Variables that have been made into parameters are known as what we call exposed parameters. So once they've become a parameter, they're called an exposed parameter, and that's when you see that little P over the oval, okay? So there's really two primary reasons to set a model variable as a parameter. The first is that output variables that are set as model parameters are added to the map when the model is run as a geoprocessing tool. So you're essentially saying that this model parameter, once it's been run, the output variables are going to be added to the map. And obviously not every output layer is added to the map. Sometimes data are intermediate data, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But if it's a output variable with a parameter, that means you're choosing an output location, and you have an option of where you want to put it if it's a parameter. Another reason to set a model variable as a parameter is that variables that are set as a model parameter appear as a tool parameter when the model is run as a geoprocessing tool, right? So remember that when you start with a model, let's say it's simple or it's complex, ultimately it can be saved and shared with others and run as a tool. So variables that are set as a model parameter appear as a tool parameter when the model is run as a geoprocessing tool, just like any other geoprocessing tool, whether it be buffer, intersect, union, identify, any sort of identify, any kind of option like that. And that allows you to specify different data or different values for your model to process than what was specified when the model was created. So think about it as it's the flexibility to change the inputs, change the outputs, change the parameters of specific geoprocessing tools. It's essentially the flexibility of making a real customizable tool that others can actually use, as opposed to a predetermined input, model geoprocessing tool parameter, and then predefined output location. It's the flexibility to change each of those along the way. So how do we create a model parameter? To create a parameter variable, you right click on a tool in the model diagram, then just select model parameter, or just parameter in this case. And then obviously when you see that P, you know that it's been successfully defined as a parameter. If you're using ArcMap, obviously in our class at Cypress College, that's outside of the scope for this class, but if you're seeing this video and you're using ArcMap, know that it's essentially the exact same process. Okay, so the methods for setting a model parameter in ArcMap are virtually the same. You right click on that specific input or geoprocessing tool or output oval, and then you just mark it as model parameter. And then again, you'll see that little P, and that tells you that it's now an exposed parameter. All right, standalone variables. What are those? So standalone variables are elements in a model that hold a value or a reference to data stored on a disk. Okay, so stored locally or stored, in an enterprise environment. A variable can be created and used as a tool parameter. There are two different types of variables: data variables and value variables. Data variables are model elements that contain descriptive information about data stored on disk. Those properties of the data that are described in a data variable include field information, so what's in the specific field, spatial reference, so what's the projection, coordinate system, things like that, and path, which would be the location on a drive or on a disk. Okay, so data variables are model elements that contain descriptive information about data stored on disk. The other type of standalone variable would be value variables. Value variables are values such as strings, that would be text, numbers, Boolean operators, so true or false, if then, that sort of thing. That would be like and, or, not, or, exclusive or, things like that. So Booleans, spatial references, linear units, and extents. So those value variables are values such as those, and value variables contain anything except for references to data stored on disk. So think of your data variables as referring to specific actual data that is accessible, and values as what do we do, or how do we treat those data? Do we is it going to be string data? Are we going to define it as a string, as text, or are we going to define this as an and, or are we going to choose what we're going to do with it, essentially? So value variables are what we do with the data, whereas data variables are the actual referenced data themselves. So reasons to create and use variables in a model. The model variable must be used when defining model parameters. Model variables can connect multiple tools to the same data or value without having to specify the same data or value on multiple tool dialog boxes. So model variables essentially allow you to reuse the same data or value over and over without having to keep dragging it onto the model builder environment. Exposing tool parameters as variables can make a model easier to read and understand. Again, without having to drag the data or the value onto the model environment multiple times, it essentially keeps the model more concise, easier to read, easier to understand for others. And finally, model variables allow for inline variable substitutions to be used in the model, and I'll define inline variable substitutions momentarily. So how do we create standalone variables? To create a model variable or standalone variable using the create variable option, you'll see in the ModelBuilder tab, when you have ModelBuilder open, there's a ModelBuilder tab that is a contextual tab that will be open. In the insert group, you will see this variable button, and that will bring up the variable data type window. you can also click Control E, and that will also bring up the variable data type window. And this opens the variable data type window with a large array, a drop-down menu of multiple types of variables that you can choose. All right, so I mentioned just a second ago, inline variables. What are inline variables? So inline variables are essentially on-the-fly variables. So inline variables, the contents of a variable can be used as a substitute for another variable by enclosing the substituting variable in percent signs. So percent sign, word stands for a variable, then another percent sign. Substituting variables in this manner is called inline variable substitution. And a simple example of this would be replacing some text or value with some other. So the sample I have right here is PD underscore percent sign incident percent sign underscore buffer. So it's that within the percent signs, that incident can actually be a variable that's pulled from some other location. Maybe it's in a column or a field in some other data set, or maybe it's an input that you change as the user. But essentially, what you can do is change the output, a specific word in the output data set. And so that's what that is. Essentially, it's like a wild card that can then be changed by the user. All right. Finally, we have intermediate data. And I mentioned this last week. Intermediate data is essentially data that only serve a limited finite purpose and don't need to be included in the final output of the data. So when a model is run, output data are created for each process in the model. Some of this output data is only created as a middle step, like a stepping stone from the beginning to the end, to connect to other processes that will create the final output. All right. So the data generated from these middle steps are called intermediate data, and they're often, but not always, of no use once the model has finished running. So if it's an important step along the way, but that specific step doesn't need to be included in the final output, we define that data as intermediate data, and essentially the way it's treated is differently than non-intermediate data. You can think of intermediate data as temporary scratch data that should be deleted after the model is run. So it exists for a time, temporarily, and then it's deleted. And again, it's important. You need to have that to get from start to finish, but that intermediate data doesn't necessarily need to exist once the model has finished running. So when you run a model from ModelBuilder window, intermediate data is not deleted. It's up to you to delete it yourself. So be aware of that. So it's not actually put onto the map. It still exists, but just be aware of that. So it's sort of like put into a scratch folder for you. So all the data variables except the existing data and the final output variables are automatically marked as intermediate in a model. To determine if a data variable is in a model is considered intermediate, or change the status of a variable that is intermediate, you can right-click the variable and click intermediate. There's also an intermediate button as well. So if you click on a data output and highlight it, so it has those little boxes around it, there's an intermediate button on the top of your ModelBuilder ribbon as well. Okay. All right, so that concludes this week's fairly quick lecture for this week's lab. If you're a student at Cypress College, what I'm looking for is an exported graphic of your completed model, just like last week, and also a PDF of your map. And again, make sure you give yourself plenty of time to complete this week's lab. It is a fairly long one, about 2 hours. And so don't wait until the last minute. Make sure that you are being diligent and smart with your time this week. So just give yourself enough time. So that's what I'm looking for. And on that note, have a great week. Thank you for your time. And until next time, bye-bye.